Hello, everyone. Let me start by thanking the organization for accepting my talk, and let me talk a little bit about Backstage. I also want to thank everyone that is present and attending the talk, and I hope this is informative to all of you and set you out on a path of building developer platforms for all of our teams, and by using Backstage in particular. So today, what we'll be covering are some problems that we might have that Backstage might help us overcome. We'll see what Backstage is. We'll give an overview about its architecture and how we could see what its components and how we could deploy it. And then we'll see some of its core features, namely the catalog, technical docs, and software templates. We'll try and do something a little bit different. Instead of only describing those components and sharing some screenshots and whatnot, we'll actually try and build a Backstage installation locally and actually see those features in practice. One of the features that we will not be covering today, which was recently announced by the Backstage team, is the integration with Kubernetes, but I'll be covering that in a feature blog post on my blog. So stay tuned and we'll be sharing it. I'll be sharing it in the next few weeks. So this might be you. So maybe you joined a new company and you need to find where things are. So you need to find some kind of documentation about where the services are. You need to find the code. So you go into GitHub. You need to find where logs are. So maybe you go into Kibana or Splunk. You need to understand how builds are done. So go into your CI system. You need to find where are the metrics. So you go into Grafana, for example. You need to understand the architecture. Maybe you go into a Kubernetes cluster and so on and so forth. Maybe you change teams and you have to go into the whole process again. It would be nice if we had some sort of standardization and some way of finding that information. And maybe you're in the middle of an incident and now you're going from system to system, trying to find metrics in Grafana, receiving alerts on PagerDuty, seeing logs, and trying to correlate all this kind of information. Maybe go into your CI/CD system to see what was built and what was deployed, checking the Kubernetes cluster to see what version is running, if some sort of deployment has been done. So there's a lot of our work is to going into different systems and try to correlate information and try to find out things. So what are some of the problems that we face on our day-to-day jobs that Backstage might help us overcome? So we have complex infrastructures. So that complexity can come from the infrastructure systems and the architecture itself. Maybe we have a lot of components, maybe we have a lot of moving pieces. We have message queues, we have databases, we have load balancers, we have a bunch of microservices, and that complexity it's present on our days. Also, some of that complexity can come from our heterogeneous infrastructure. Maybe we have stuff on the cloud. Maybe we have an on-premise infrastructure. Maybe some applications are deployed in VMs. Others are in Kubernetes clusters. So there's a lot that we need to handle. Another issue that we might face on a daily basis is some lack of standardization. This could mean a lot of things, but one of the things that it can mean is that, for example, we have two different applications, even using the same stack, that have different configurations. The code inside the repository is completely different, also in different folders. Logging is set up in a different way. And of course, we can also have, like we've seen before, different ways where the application is running. Some is running in containers, some are running in VMs, something are running on-prem. So if we are going back and forth and trying to understand things, this lack of standardization makes our lives a little bit harder. We also have a multitude of systems. So if I need to check documentation, I need to go into one place. If I need to check logs, I need to go into that place. And then another place, I'm receiving alerts from another system. So we have a lot of systems that we need to juggle on our daily jobs. And it would be nice if we have at least some entry point where I can find where all the information is about a system, or at least an entry point that would point me to the right direction instead of me trying to finding out where that information is. Another issue that usually arises with a lack of standardization in complex infrastructures is fragmented deployment pipelines. So because sometimes we lack standardization, different applications are deployed in different ways, and even very similar applications are deployed in very different ways. we have to figure out how each application is deployed. If we do one change because we have a bug in a deployment pipeline, that doesn't get reflected into other pipelines. So we have a lot of fragmentation within those pipelines themselves. And this comes at a cost of hindered productivity. If we are constantly struggling and trying to find information and correlating that information from system to system, from pipeline to pipeline, from one system to another, this of course hinders our productivity that could be used to actually being developing new things or to trying to be more productive overall. So what is Backstage? So Backstage is an open platform for building developer platforms. This is a platform to unify all of our infrastructure tooling, services, documentations, and to create a streamlined development environment from end to end. The idea for Backstage is that teams can maintain standards and best practices across the whole organization and have a standardized way software, provide a central place to manage all projects and documentation, enable scalability and extensibility by allowing integrations with tools, which in Backstage are called plugins, and we can do much more. So Backstage has its own website. For a little bit of context and history, Backstage was developed within Spotify. It's been in use in production in Spotify for roughly 4 to 5 years. And early last year, the Backstage team on Spotify, after being contacted by several teams and showcasing their internal tools, decided to actually open source the project and make it available for all of us. So let's start with our first task, which is try to build a Backstage app in locally and see the features that we're going to see next on a local installation. So we have 2 ways to actually build a Backstage installation. The first one is to actually fork the repository, and it's recommended to use that approach if we want to change some behavior or internal for Backstage, or if we want to develop a plugin. The recommended way to actually do Backstage installation is to actually create an app, and the Backstage team provided a scaffolder called create app, which we are going to run, and it basically will ask us a couple of questions, and then we'll do the scaffolding process itself. So it just takes a few seconds. So it's going to ask me for a name from my app. I'm going to call it demo, and it's going to ask me for a database for its backend. We're going to choose SQLite for testing purposes. So this will take a couple of minutes. We'll get back to this in a few minutes. So what does Backstage look under the hood? So Backstage is made of mostly 3 components. The first one is the core UI. So the UI is a thin client-side wrapper around a set of plugins. It provides some core UI components and libraries for shared activities such as config management. This can be seen here in the diagram. This is what the user usually sees. The another component are the UI plugins and their backing services. So each plugin is a client-side application which mounts itself on the UI. Those plugins are written in TypeScript or JavaScript. They each live on their own directory inside Backstage plugins folder. Each plugin typically makes itself available on the UI on a dedicated URL. So here we have some examples of some plugins and their backing services. Those plugins can be of 3 types. They can be standalone, which means that they run entirely on the browser, and the Tech Radar plugin is one of its examples. They can be service-backed, which means they make API requests to a service within the Backstage installation. For example, the Lighthouse plugin makes requests to the Lighthouse backend, which is also powered by a database. And we have third-party backed plugins, which make API external services through a proxy. For example, the Circle CI plugin makes requests to the Circle CI, for example, to get build information, and it goes through a proxy. The other component of Backstage is its database. So Backstage uses the Next library, which supports a multitude of databases. But despite that, Backstage has been tested to work with SQLite for testing and local installations only, and PostgreSQL for production workloads. Backstage, of course, can be containerized, so many of these components can be built in their own container and follow a microservices architecture, and they can be deployed with Kubernetes, and they even have Helm charts to actually deploy this in Kubernetes. So now we have an overview of its architecture, we're going to start to see some of its components. So the first component that we're going to see is the catalog. So the idea for the catalog is to be the centralized hub to track ownership and metadata of all software in our ecosystem. What this means is that it will be a catalog of everything that we have in terms of software in our companies, meaning that it can be data pipelines, documentation projects, APIs, libraries, services, whatever we want, it will be available on a catalog. Metadata YAML files will be at the heart of the catalog, and they will live alongside the code, and this will enable Backstage to collect and make it visible to the catalog and in the interface as well. Catalog will allow teams to manage and maintain their software within a uniform view. So every system, every service, every API will be present on a catalog with a uniform view, and they will be also discoverable within our organization. So it'll be easier for us to actually check where everything is and where are those services. So let's see if our installation actually has finished. It actually has. So we go into our repository. We can see that we have a lot of files that have been created for us. So we'll start our local installation of Backstage. So we'll start, it will open a browser tab. This will take a few seconds. We'll just have to wait a little bit. Should be up any minute. Now we're going to just go make a quick tour of Backstage running locally, and then we'll see how the catalog works. So here we go, almost there. So here we go. So this is a basic Backstage installation. It comes bundled in with a few demo projects that we're going to see. So we have here a search that we can also do here. We have a menu. We have, for example, the Tech Radar plugin that we just seen. So it fetches this information from the Backstage installation. And here we have on our main page, we have our catalog, and we'll see, for example, the artist lookup project. We can see that it points already to a GitHub repository, which has all the code, who owns it. We can see that Team A owns it. And we can see, if we go into this page, if who Team A is, who are its members, if they have any more services. So it makes really convenient to actually find who owns things and if they own anything else. And we can see a lot of information here. So how can we actually add something to Backstage? So we have a few options. We can actually create a component, which we'll see later in this talk, and that will be automatically registered within Backstage. So if we create a component within Backstage, it will already be registered. We have a few options for service discovery. For example, if we use GitHub, there's a plugin which will actually search our organization for a specific file on each repository, and then will automatically register. But for the sake of example, we'll just add we'll add statically a repository. So I'll use one of my repositories from a previous demo, and there will be a file called catalog info that has some information that that Backstage will use to actually find this repository and add it to the catalog. If you're used to deploying stuff to Kubernetes, you're already used with this kind of format of file. So here we are declaring a kind of component. There's an API version, and there's a lot of some fields. So we're declaring a name for this project, a description, some text to make it plural, and then there's a spec. We're saying this is of type service. It will be used in production, and who the owner is. So now that we have this file, we need to go into Backstage and tell it to actually find this repository. And how will we do this? So if we go into our Backstage installation, so this is a normal app, and there's a file here called app config. So the first thing that we need to do is actually plug it to GitLab, which is where my code is. So you see here that I have the same information for GitHub. So I'm going to just have here an integration for GitLab. So this token will be used to actually fetch information from GitLab. And then I need to tell it to actually find that repository. So because this is a static installation, going inside catalog, locations, I'm going to just add something of type URL, and I'm just pointing to that file. And there's all there is to it. So if I restart my Backstage installation, in a couple of seconds, I should see my repository reflected on a catalog. If I add it through the interface, it would have been automatically added to the catalog. So let's just wait a few more seconds. Shouldn't take more than 5 seconds. Here we go. Just starting up. Here we go. So as we can see, we now have here a new project. We can see that the user is the one that we registered. We enter the project. We see that it's pointing to the repository. We're going to see and check exactly that that's the repository that we gave. And we can plug in here stuff like our CI/CD, some API documentation, some kind of documentation, tech docs. It's already present here, but we're going to see that in a bit. So easily we added a new project to our Backstage installation. So what comes next? Next feature we'll see about Backstage is tech docs. Tech docs is documentation as code, and it's a built-in solution. And this basically means that we can write our documentation files and they can live alongside our code. It's based on mkdocs, but there are plans to support other types of resources. So the idea is that the Backstage will support other type of static assets, and this is being discussed and being deployed at the moment. This enables documentation to be found on the service page of the catalog. So if we go into the catalog, we find a service, and documentation will be already available there, and makes it very, very convenient. And everything will be built with Markdown. So how does tech docs work? Tech docs generates documentation in a 3-step process. First step is to prepare, which means fetching the source files from the source code and pass them to a generator step. The generator step will be the step that runs the build phase. That will be done through a container or the mkdocs CLI. And the last step will be the publish, which essentially takes those static assets and uploads it to some sort of cloud storage. So this example here is the example that we would actually do in production. So our documentation will live alongside code. Our CI system with the pull request will actually build those assets and upload them to some kind of cloud storage. And when we requested it from Backstage, Backstage will go to that cloud storage and make it available for us. For our demo that we are going to do here, we're going to actually do everything locally. We will not be doing all this part. We just want to see how this works. So all these steps will be done on a local installation. So how would we plug this into Backstage and make them available on Backstage? If you look at our catalog info, we have here an annotation that just says to Backstage that this repository will be enabling docs. That's just it. Then we have an mkdocs file, which basically tells mkdocs what to do. So we'll mostly be using the default settings. So we're essentially setting a site name. We're configuring navigation just to look at an index file, and we're saying that the plugin that who is going to build this documentation is TechDocs core. And by default, Backstage looks for a docs folder and an index.md file within that folder, and then follows everything that mkdocs supports. So this index.md file is just a copy of our README file, and that's about it. Now, on the Backstage side, what we need to do. So within the app config file, we just need to configure those steps that we've just seen to actually build, and we're declaring that we're going to build locally. How to generate? We're going to use a Docker container, because this already has all the dependencies. We don't need to actually install all the dependencies that mkdocs needs locally, and the publishing will also be locally. And that's all there is to it. If we go now into our Backstage installation, we can see that inside the Git Flux Helm, because we already had those files, we have here View Tech Docs already in blue. And if we click it, this is the first time, though, so it's going to actually fetch, prepare, and publish. That's why it takes a few seconds. Then the next iteration, it will be already cached. So we see that Backstage already fetches those documentations, renders them, and make them available. And of course, everything that we can do with mkdocs, we can put in here, so we can have as many docs as we want and as many complexity as we want. So this actually makes it really convenient, because we can find documentation, we can find a project, and we can find documentation right on the spot. Next, we have software templates. So the idea for software templates is to help us create components right from inside Backstage. It has the ability to load skeletons of code, template from some variables from some templates, and then publish that template to some locations like GitLab or GitHub, for example. It's also able to glue together several pieces. What I mean by this is that we can do things like create a repository, create a CI/CD pipeline, hook up, for example, with Circle CI. So because this is all code that runs behind the scenes, it virtually we can do anything that you want as long as it works with code. So we'll see how we can do this inside Backstage, and then we'll see how Backstage actually does this under the hood. So if we go into Backstage again, here we have a button called Create Component. And here we have something called Golang microservices that we are going to use. So what we're going to choose this one, and we're going to create a new component. But then we'll see what this component, what we'll be doing. So I'm just giving myself as being a unique name for the component. Actually, the unique name for a component will be Go Demo. It will be a Go Demo project. We're just saying that for it to use an Alpine-based image for running the service, we're going to see that the build phase will be using a Golang image, and then we're passing a bunch of configurations that we'll see that will be added to the repository. So basically, we're enabling logger's logging, we're setting Viper for configuration, we're enabling Corba for CLI tools, and for example, let's just choose Travis as our CI system. So next, we'll give it an owner. I'm setting myself as the owner. We need to tell it where to actually store this configuration. So for the sake of example, I'm going to store it here, and I'm going to give it a name. We're going to call Go Demo, and let's say that it's for public access. Next step, we'll actually review. So it's basically just showing up, showing me all the information that I entered. It looks okay. So we're going to hit create. So now what Backstage will do is actually going to combine those variables that I gave it, pass it to the backend, and then the backend will actually do all the heavy lifting for me. So as we can see, it has already finished. We can see all the steps. So it basically did some preparation, it did some analysis, it generated some templates, and it actually published whatever we needed to do. So let's take a look in the catalog. So as we can see, it's already registered in the catalog with a name that we gave it, which is called Go Demo. Here we can see that it's pointing to some source code. We'll see that source code in a bit. I am the owner. It's of type service. So a lot here was done for us. So now if we go into the repository, we see that a lot of code was already built for us. It was just published. So it essentially produced the catalog info file like we had in the previous example. So it registered a component. It said it is of type service and a bunch of other information. It also scaffolded a main Go file with some templating. It set up a file for building stuff with Travis, and of course, it configured our logging, gave us Viper for configuration, and enabled Corba for CLI commands. So all of this, of course, there's also a makefile for building the project. So all of this was done to us by was done for us and already registered. So if I now want to use this project, I just need to clone it and start working. But how did Backstage did this under the hood? So if we take a look into our catalog, we'll see that here we have a section called templates, and I have something here called cookie cutter go, which points to a template file. So let's quickly see this file. And essentially this file is a template for the UI interface that we've just seen. So it basically presents us with a lot of options. For example, the component ID, things like, do I want to enable logging? How do I want my CI/CD? So Backstage reads this and knows how to display this to the user, and then collects the variables that we entered and provides the backend, and the backend knows what to do. But how does the backend know how to do that? All those things that we've just seen. If you look into packages, backend, source, plugins, there's something here called scaffolder. And as we can see, we have something here called Cookie Cutter. For those who don't know, Cookie Cutter is a framework for jumpstarting production-ready Golang projects. So, and Backstage already has support for cookie cutter projects. So this means that all of that information is fed to this cookie cutter import. So a new object is created. Then cookie cutter, based on that information, knows that it needs to create a repository, that needs to create a file for Thrive CI, needs to create, for example, a Corba configuration for commands, and so on and so forth. And essentially, this means that everything that we can do with code, we can basically create our own TypeScript or JavaScript code, for example, to hook in CI/CD systems, create templates for deployments into Kubernetes, and so on and so forth. So this is essentially code. So whatever we need to do, we can do it with code. A lot still needs to be done, of course. Backstage is still in construction, but we can see that it serves as the basis for a lot of the deployments. And going back to our presentation. So this was an introduction to Backstage. So the idea here is to have an idea of Backstage is, what it can do for us, some of the core features that Backstage already has. As I've said in the beginning, Backstage was only open source last year. The open source version is a little bit slimmer than the one that Spotify uses internally, but a lot has been going on in the last year. A lot of plugins have been added, a lot of integrations has been added. It's an open source project, so we can just go there and hack our way in. I know of a few companies that already are building and open sourcing a lot of plugins. So some of these things we need to just go into Backstage website and see if a new plugin has come in, and eventually contribute to the project itself. I will also be leaving here a few links about the Backstage website, of course, some blog posts from Spotify talking a little bit about Backstage and what kinds of problems does Backstage solve for them. A link for the docs for Backstage. There's a lot of information there. Although Backstage is still in its early infancy, there's a lot of information there that we can use to actually build our own developer platform, and a few links to blog posts that will actually help us jumpstart this Backstage journey and help us build some foundation that we can then iterate upon. And that's it from my part. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope this gives you a nice introduction into building your own developer platforms and aggregating a lot of information that we have scattered around. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. That looks really great, and like myself will make sure that to give it a go. Yep. It's time for the Q&A session. I can see that we have a single Q&A, a single question. Question from Alexei is: how will catalog look like with 100+ applications?
So the catalog will grow, so it's paged. We have, for example, in our case, we have roughly above 100. So here it's paged with 20 rows, but we don't actually go back and forth in actually discovering services. The search functionality works really well. It's powered by a database underneath. We can just go here and find information. So this is mostly what we use. For example, in our team, we're mostly an SRE team, and we interface with a lot of teams, and sometimes we need to find information for a specific component. So we just go here, do a git search, go into to the page of that specific service, see where the source code is, see some docs. So the interesting part is that it makes it really easy to actually find that information. Of course, this search also works for tags and teams, so it's really nice. Something that we sometimes use a lot is also going to the team to find information about the team itself. So the search part is actually what we actually leverage on a daily basis.
Okay, great, thank you. So, Ricardo, I would like to invite you to your dedicated Discord channel, and I would like to ask every participant of our conference to also go there, ask the questions directly to Ricardo. I'm sure they're going to be answered there. So we are again going to have a short break, and we'll back at 12:10 for a log management.